This week on Newsnight, the second of our two-part look back at 2024 and the stories we've covered here on the programme. Tonight, some of the most consequential bills signed into law in 2024, including some that have just taken effect at the start of January. Newsnight starts now. Hello, I'm Steve Mort. Welcome to Newsnight, where we take an in-depth look at the top stories and issues in Central Florida and how they shape our community. This week, we're bringing you the second of two special episodes of Newsnight, looking back at some of the top stories of 2024 that we've covered here on the program. Florida lawmakers will begin 2025 by drawing up bills they hope will pass the legislative session that gets underway in Tallahassee in March. The priorities for the new House and Senate leadership are taking shape following a busy session in 2024 that included the passage of a number of bills that came into effect just a couple of days ago on January 1st. Among them, a ban on children younger than 16 from using certain social media services, with an exception for 14 and 15-year-olds who get parental consent. It's a law that has First Amendment and privacy advocates concerned. After the bill was signed into law, Crystal Knowles talked with one family worried about the impact on parental rights.
Just days before the end of the legislative session, lawmakers reintroduced and passed a social media bill with modifications.
We know from all the research that the main place where crimes against children happen are online social media platforms. We addressed that this year in a way that I think puts us ahead of other states, will be sustained both legally and is also effective. We know that in addition to crimes against children, we see record deterioration in the mental health of our kids, whether it's anorexia or self-harm, or even having almost a third of high school women that have contemplated suicide in the last year.
For anyone under 16, social media is off limits, except for 14 and 15-year-olds with parental consent. But that's not sitting well with Kelly Rydell, who supervises her 10-year-old daughter's social media use.
I don't agree with the government telling me what I can do with my kids with social media. So there are good parts to social media, and the kids do use it sometimes to communicate with friends and or with their teachers for classes, so there is some good. And I believe the parent or the caretaker for the child should be in charge of their limitations on social media.
It's unclear which social media sites will be restricted. Rydell's 10-year-old daughter, Brooklyn, hopes to be a child actor. She uses social media to follow other child actors and says she's okay with her mom supervising her when she's online.
They should have some sort of supervision by their parents and them knowing what they're posting, because they could be posting bad stuff that should not be posted when you're a kid under 15. So I do think that it's fun to have it, but I think you need supervision, and you just need to make sure that you're doing the right thing on there and you're not doing anything that's not appropriate for your age or something.
The bill places responsibility for enforcing rules with social media platforms, which could face civil penalties if they fail to do so. But legal challenges are likely as tech companies push back in Florida and other states.
Crystal Knowles reporting there. The social media law is now in effect, but the DeSantis administration says it won't immediately start enforcing it against major platforms until the courts have ruled on it. Back in March, I discussed it when the bill passed with Greg Angel, at the time with Spectrum News 13, Talia Blake from Central Florida Public Media, and Christopher Heath, at that time with WFTV Channel 9. The governor vetoed a previous social media bill despite bipartisan support for it, right? I mean, why do supporters think this effort is better?
I think they feel like on the margins they've changed it enough by giving some leeway for people who are 16, 15 to get parental authorization, and then banning it from there on down. They feel like they've made enough changes to make the governor happy. At the end of the day, the governor may or may not sign it, but what we are going to have to wait and see is how do the courts suss all this out? Right now, the Fifth Circuit's already taking up a Texas case dealing with some of these things. Utah has had a couple bites at this apple trying to get it constitutionally correct, and they haven't been able to do it. So I don't know that they've ultimately solved the problem of overreach quite frankly, and intruding into people's private lives in the name of protecting children, which is why it got bipartisan support. Everyone wants to protect children. We all want to protect children, but you can't burn the Constitution to the ground to protect children. You've got to balance the two.
And some people would say children, of course, also have constitutional rights of free speech and so forth. I mean, Greg, there is confusion over which social media sites might even be wrapped up in this. I mean, how do they define social media?
Well, the legislature has put in broad bullet points, if you will, talk about whether 10% of users are of or below a certain age, whether there's features within these apps include constant scrolling, sharing content, and viewing other people's content,
breaks and things,
page breaks, pop-up alerts. It also goes a little bit further to define that some of these apps where they are direct messages from one person to another person would not be included. So WhatsApp, for example, since that's a direct-to-direct messaging. But really, when you look at the language, it really includes the Twitter, the X, not sure what we're calling it these days, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok, and whichever ones are still out there. So it really kind of gives the broad language. And of course, that's going to eventually come back to First Amendment and how it applies. Because it's also the argument, you're talking about some of the challenges, Chris, in some of the other states. It's that patchwork effect. How is it one state or this state can do something? How do you enforce that?
I mean, there is a requirement for third-party anonymous age verification for social media. I mean, first of all, and also for adult websites as well. I mean, first of all, what are the requirements there, Talia?
Yeah, so they want this anonymous age verification, which we don't really exactly know how that's going to play out. We're still going to have to wait and see what that's going to look like. And one of the requirements is that after you put your information into whatever the verification site is, that information immediately gets deleted after that you've been verified. How we're going to know if that information gets deleted is still yet to be seen. But the main thing is that, okay, yes, you're going to have to verify your information, but we're not going to store it anywhere. It's not going to be stored in some outside database somewhere else. It's going to be deleted, but we're not really sure if that's going to happen.
And the courts have referenced this in previous cases, talking about, we're not opposed to age verification if the technology exists.
That's right.
Basically leaving that door open that if we ever get the technology that's flawless enough that it protects everyone and doesn't violate the Constitution, we're fine with it. But does that technology exist?
All right, a reminder, you can find every episode of Newsnight anytime on our website. Be sure to catch us online at wucf.org/Newsnight or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, next tonight, Florida's new ban on homeless people sleeping outside. In October, we reported that local governments were well behind in their efforts to come up with solutions for providing shelter for the thousands of homeless people in Central Florida. First, you'll hear my story on that from October, followed by our conversation with Alexa Lorenzo from WFTV Channel 9, Lillian Hernandez-Caraballo from Central Florida Public Media, and Ryan Gillespie from the Orlando Sentinel.
Florida lawmakers passed legislation to ban homeless people from camping on city streets, sidewalks, and parks.
From a statewide perspective, we're not going to let any city turn into a San Francisco. Not on our watch. We're not going to let that happen.
In June, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that cities around the country could enforce bans like the one passed in Florida, which have drawn criticism from advocates for homeless people.
It's hard for me to be supportive of legislation like that. I personally would like to see maybe some data on how that is an effective way in helping end homelessness.
The largest number of homeless people are in Orange County, particularly to the west of downtown Orlando, and finding shelters to help comply with the incoming law is proving tough. This building is one example. The city of Orlando had hoped to use this site in West Lakes as an emergency overnight shelter, but a barrage of local opposition forced the city to shelve its plans to spend $7.5 million to buy the unused warehouse. But even had the plans been well received, there still wouldn't have been enough beds to meet demand. Orange County recently added $10 million to its budget to fund homeless agencies, but a Sentinel investigation shows efforts across the region are lagging well behind, with counties and cities unlikely to have enough facilities in place to comply with the law.
All right, Lillian, first off, remind us exactly what the law passed earlier this year aims to prevent and what it requires from local agencies.
cities and counties are no longer allowed to let people just sleep in public, in their cars, in little camps, tents, in the woods, anything that is public space. The state says, no, you guys are not allowed to let that happen anymore. If you are going to let people camp somewhere, it has to be a designated zone. You are allowed to give them designated zones to camp in and or sleep in if you want to. But if you do that, then the state gives them a bit of a litany of requirements, yes, standards and mandates that they must follow, including security. They have to have drug rehab, mental health resources, running water, which could be interpreted in a number of ways, restrooms, and so on.
All of those sanitation facilities. The
Correct.
Supreme Court did weigh in on these kinds of bans earlier this year on, homeless people sleeping in public places. What did the Supreme Court have to say about that, whether it was okay for local governments to punish people if they had nowhere else to go?
Yeah, this was a decision that was highly anticipated. People across the country were awaiting this, and in the opinion, it was pretty cut and dry. They found that fining and arresting does not violate the amendment for cruel and unusual punishment, allowing Florida the green light to move forward with this. And this decision, I believe, was in the summer, so it gave them a few months to try to find their footing before this law took effect October 1st. But I'll tell you, the morning of October 1st, we were reporting on this, and there were dozens upon dozens of people still sleeping in public. There are right now. This is not being, at this point, enforced because it's so fresh, so new. There are so many question marks.
Well, that brings me to your reporting, Ryan, and how the implementation of this is going. It sounds from what Alexa's saying not particularly well. You've been trying to get answers from local authorities about how their preparations are going. What have you been finding?
So on the law enforcement side, I don't think I have come across a law enforcement agency that's excited about the prospect of arresting people for sleeping outside.
Yeah.
They don't see it, and really nobody sees it, as an overly productive way to solve the problem. All you're really doing is giving somebody the most expensive shelter bed that our society can offer for a couple of days. And then they're back out on the street in the same position they were, but now they have fines and fees associated with it. So what everybody expected would happen when this bill was passed and signed is it would start a conversation on the need for more shelter beds. Where can we send people that is not jail? That conversation is very much in its infancy, and in a lot of cases, I would say not happening. We surveyed many of our cities and counties across the region very recently, and everybody was generally pointing the finger at each other of like, hey, we're waiting for Seminole County to come up with a plan, or hey, we'd like Osceola to be the leader down there. Where we've seen a little bit of progress, though nothing substantive. The city of Orlando brought forward a plan for a shelter a month or two ago. It died on the vine very quickly due to neighborhood feedback. The city is actively looking for places that would not be in Paramore, where the rest of our region's shelter beds are, for a bed. Orange County has set aside some funding as well for some places in West Orange, but nobody has found a site yet.
You can always join the conversation on any of the issues we discuss here on Newsnight on social media. We're at WCF-TV on Facebook and Instagram. We're also at Newsnight WCF on X. Another law that passed in 2024 in Florida dealt with heat protections. That came into effect in July. It preempts local heat exposure protections for workers and prevents local governments from imposing wage requirements on contractors. More than 90 organizations signed a letter calling on the governor to veto the bill amid a study by the Workers' Compensation Research Institute finding, quote, strong and robust evidence that excessive heat increases the frequency of injuries. First, let's hear a report that Newsnight's Crystal Knowles put together on the legislation back in May.
The Sunshine State is best known for its orange groves and year-round beach weather. But its never-ending sunshine can be deadly, especially for those who work outside. Ernesto Ruiz from the Farm Worker Association of Florida explains that in the agriculture business, taking breaks can lead to lower income for farm workers.
Oftentimes, these workers are paid on a piece rate basis, meaning they're paid based on how much they produce. So there's a disincentive against taking breaks. And the workers tell us this. They're like, no, I don't want to take a break because I want to make more money.
Parts of Florida are continuing to experience record heat for this time of year. And Bureau of Labor Statistic figures show heat-related deaths for field workers are becoming more prevalent. Almost 100 workers died between 2020 and 2021.
Our legislator, our governor, previously passed heat-related protections for student athletes because 2 high school athletes died tragically. They shouldn't have. So they understand the physiology, they understand the risk. What they don't seem to share is the ability to humanize different populations.
The nonprofit Workers' Compensation Research Institute recently released a study looking at how temperatures affect the number of work-related injuries amongst construction workers, landscapers, pavers, and others exposed to the baking heat. Ramona Tanabe is the Institute's president.
What we found was that the data showed an increase in the probability of work-related injuries of about 5 to 6% when the maximum daily temperature was above 90 degrees compared to a day where it was between 65 and 70 degrees. Not only direct injuries that you think of when you have excessive heat, like fainting from heat or heat exhaustion or heat cramps, but it was also indirect injuries where the heat has an effect on motor skills, perceptual skills, and cognitive abilities.
But supporters of Florida's law preempting local heat protections say it's in the best interest of businesses to keep their employees safe. The bill's co-sponsor, Fort Myers Republican State Representative Tiffany Esposito, says adding government requirements is unnecessary.
It really came from hearing concerns from the business community and from business leaders throughout the state about local mandates. And we wanted to make sure that we passed a bill to ensure worker safety, uphold federal OSHA standards. My husband works construction. He's worked construction for nearly 20 years. So this is something that is near and dear to me and that I've had personal experience with my family.
Esposito says since the country is dealing with higher than normal costs of everyday items, including produce, any new regulations would create a negative financial ripple effect.
I think the top misconception is that we're harming workers, which is absolutely inaccurate. Let me be very clear in that the safety of Florida's workers is our top priority. And this bill strikes a balance between upholding worker safety and giving businesses the ability to operate successfully without the threat of redundant red tape that drives up the cost for consumers.
Crystal Knowles reporting there. Well, to discuss the issue of heat protections, I was joined in the studio by Talia Blake from Central Florida Public Media, Beth Kassab from the Winter Park Voice, and Matthew Petty from WUSF.
Water breaks, shade breaks, training for workers, things to kind of make sure that they aren't getting heat exhaustion. Local governments just aren't allowed to mandate any of that.
Representative Esposito, Beth, told Crystal that employers can follow those sort of federal OSHA standards, but the federal government kind of lacks specific heat rules for workers. Does this sort of leave a lot of people without protections, at least for now?
For now, yes. The OSHA rules that are in place right now do lack specificity, like you said, and also they have found to be really hard to enforce. So OSHA is working on broader and more encompassing guidelines. At least that's the signals that we've seen, and that is happening now, but the timeline is unclear. So yes, without local regulations for now, there's not much to enforce.
Talia, you cover the economy, right? I mean, what are the opponents of heat protection saying? Why do they think it's not necessary to have those kinds of protections in place?
Well, at the local level, they're kind of saying, like, what's the point if there are already federal protections? OSHA already has federal guidelines for work related issues, including heat risk. So they're kind of like, it's a little redundant for us to write it down at the local level as well.
Yeah, your colleague Jessica Mazzaros, Matt, has discussed this issue with workers themselves that work in the heat. What's she been hearing from them about their perspective?
Well, I mean, they're a bit concerned about this bill because one of the things, like, she talked to a Sarasota area agricultural worker, Lucia Lopez, and she was saying that essentially, it's really hot. You have to layer up against the kind of chemicals that you're working with if you're an agricultural worker, and probably other kinds of outdoor work as well. So it's already quite kind of onerous having to have all these layers on you working out in the heat. And the other thing she pointed out was, like, they're not salaried, so there's a disincentive for them to take breaks. If they're taking a break, they're not getting paid. And one of the things that she said was she's concerned that this law will make it harder for them to get access to medical care, if there is a heat emergency, because in her case, in this particular worker's case, the nearest clinic was about 30 minutes away, and that she and other workers are kind of concerned about the access to medical care on top of everything else.
That's an interesting point, and also an interesting point about the way that pay is structured, and something we heard there from the Farm Worker Association. Beth, I mean, is Florida an outlier here, or are there other states that are following suit or doing a similar thing?
So Texas is, frequently a comparison point to Florida when it comes to regulations like this, and that's the case here with heat regulations as well. There are states that have taken a different point of view and have enacted regulations, primarily states out west. Colorado, California is looking at strengthening their regulations.
Where there are also a lot of workers working in the heat.
Correct, a lot of, again, agriculture. And so, but I should point out it's not just agriculture, even in airports, people handling baggage, people working behind the scenes. Those folks are often reporting difficult heat conditions as well. I think it's important to point out, too, in a state like Florida, you have not just a lot of outdoor workers, which is certainly the case year-round, but also people in some indoor conditions where there's just not a lot of ventilation.
Packing houses, yeah.
Right, packing houses.
Yeah.
So indoor conditions, too, where because of the outdoor heat, they're even worse because maybe not a lot of AC or any AC and not a lot of ventilation.
Our conversation back in May on heat protections. The 2025 legislative session will begin in March, and we'll be following it closely here on Newsnight. One of the issues facing lawmakers will again be condo safety and fees. Governor DeSantis had asked for a special session on the spiraling costs facing condo owners since the legislature passed laws tightening up on maintenance requirements and condo association oversight in the wake of the 2021 Surfside collapse. Lawmakers passed one of the sets of reforms in 2024 aimed at strengthening condo safety and oversight. But critics say it's resulted in sky-high costs for owners and a feeding frenzy for developers. Here's part of our discussion previewing the debate on the 2024 bill that ended up being signed into law by the governor. I was joined by Talia Blake from Central Florida Public Media, Alexa Lorenzo from WFTV Channel 9, and Curtis McLeod from Spectrum News 13.
They want accountability and they want assurances in place and oversight's in there when it comes to, having, contractors or people come in. They want a little bit more power so that they can have some say over some of these things. So what they're looking for here is some things that last bill, they didn't kind of cover that. So they're saying, hey, we need some things that are going to make sure, should something else happen, God forbid, that we are protected.
Filling in some of those gaps. And it is a pretty chunky bill from my understanding.
It's pretty extensive looking at all of it.
Which brings me on, Alexa, to sort of some of the impacts, intentional or not, from these new roles that have been implemented so far. I mean, what have we seen in the market?
So those associations, as Curtis was talking about, for years they've put off needed maintenance because of the price tag.
Yeah.
And someone's got to pay for this, right? They can front a percentage of it, but they're expensive fixes, so they need to go to those units, to those residents, those owners, renters, whatever they may be, to get some of that money. So we're starting to see some of these condo owners have increases in their maintenance fees. Some people have reported as much as 30%. They were paying $400 one month, $430 to $600 another month. And that's a tremendous increase. And the bill also allows some of these associations to do special assessments. So some people are saying, okay, now we need a new roof. So now that's another cost that people have to pay out of pocket. And some of these people who live in these condos have a fixed income that they're living off of, a low income, and it may make this condo living unaffordable for them.
And you guys at Channel 9 have done some specific reporting about this.
Yeah, they may be priced out. And when you put this with the increases we're seeing in HOA fees because of insurance premiums,
I was just about to say.
It's just adding on where someone who gets X amount for however many years they've been receiving X amount, they're not going to get Y all of a sudden. Right. So they don't have that bucket to pull from to pay for these additional fees, and they may be forced to sell.
And I know that there was one guy that I had spoken with a story we did out there, and this was like his retirement dream. And this is, when I say out there, I'm talking about Daytona Beach.
Right.
And he's like, okay, we're living right here. This is everything I've done. I've sunk my entire life savings into this place and everything. And now, he's on a fixed income, like you mentioned, and then you've got fees because they're trying to build seawalls and they're racing against the clock. And then it's like, okay, you've got those fees from the condo associations. Then you tack on insurance fees, which you just reached out to us 2 weeks ago and said, hey, look, remember I told you a few months ago back in April, hey, we may have to see some of those fees. Now he's experiencing that, issues after issues, and it happens with people. It's almost kind of a little bit disproportionate for people who live on the coast. And it's a risk that they take to live that close to the coastline. But one of the things that they deal with are those issues and, fighting the state, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, just to try to get the access to get seawalls built following the storms that came through.
One of the concerns I've seen, Alexa, about some of these changes is that they make some of these older buildings where people call home ripe for redevelopment, i.e. knocked down and new buildings built. That's a concern, correct?
And we're starting to see some of that coming from the Live Local Act that was passed recently. The intention was good, but we're starting to see some repercussions. The idea behind the Live Local Act was to increase the ability of affordable housing. So with some of this, these issues that we're seeing these areas that are ripe for development, and the Live Local Act essentially encourages developers to get the job done, but it kind of limits the impact that city and local state leaders can have on the essentially the rezoning and the housing kind of developments. So we're starting to see the city of Tampa, city of St. Petersburg, city of Winter Park try to figure out how they can implement this Live Local Act legally to still keep the essence of that area alive.
Our discussion on condo safety and oversight that passed in 2024, an issue that's also likely to be high on the agenda in Florida in 2025. But that is all the time we have for this week. We'll return with our first regular episode of the new year next Friday night at 8:30 here on WCF. In the meantime, from all of us here at Newsnight, take care and have a great week.